Okay. Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This afternoon, we're going to be enjoying a presentation on animation by Kate Sullivan. Many of you will know Kate, especially the London meeting regulars, and may remember the short video that she made promoting the Society back in 2018. It was called A Place I Love, and it was shown at the 2019 Southampton Convention. It also won second prize at the prestigious 2018 LA 3D Movie Festival in California. Kate says that her love of animation was inspired by watching Bagpuss and the Clangers in her youth. She holds a degree in film from the University of Arts, London, but her training in animation was gained at a subsequent course at Central St Martin's. Kate's professional work has appeared on TV. The animation at the start of the Shakespeare comedy Upstart Crow, starring David Mitchell, is the obvious one to mention. She's also worked on 2 Doctor Who remakes of lost shows, one starring Tom Baker and the other Patrick Troughton. And for those of you with children and grandchildren who watch CBeebies, Kate designed the characters in the Lingo Show, and there's much more. An occasional lecturer in animation herself now, Kate will share some of the insights that she gained from her animation course at Central St Martin's. Though her presentation will be focused on animation in 2D, the principles involved should be equally relevant to animation in 3D, particularly applying to titling, transitions, picture-in-picture, as well as character animation. Following Kate's talk, which will be around 45 minutes, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, after which we'll break for 10 minutes. And after the break, we'll be showing some 3D animation shows from a variety of animation stereographers. Well, that's enough for me. So now it's time to hand over to Kate.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I really hope this talk is going to be of interest. It is about animation, but as Mike said, it is stuff I'm going to be saying is related to many things that you might be creating yourselves. I'm going to be teaching you some transferable skills, and so you'll be able to apply those to things like motion graphics, obviously animation, but also things like live action filmmaking, applying it to things like camera moves, and also things like maybe adding some titles to your AV shows, and maybe sort of the way that you manipulate images on and off screen in those slideshows. Yes, that's the talk today, and I just wanted to start off with a little thing here. If you allow me to get a little bit poetic for a moment, just talking about what us animators and you stereographers, well, I'm a stereographer as well, but animators and stereographers have in common. I think we're all illusionists, okay? Animators, we take still images and we put them together. And stereographers, as you know, you take your left, you take your right, you combine these. And I think in both cases, this combination of images creates something quite magical and really quite lovely. So yeah, there's my little poetic little introduction. And I also think one thing we've got in common is that we quite often sort of spend hours alone staring at something thinking, why the hell isn't this working? Anyway, right. Introduction done. So, there's a kind of another introduction coming now, because I just want to talk about another thing that I think you could say we have in common, and that's our sort of formative years. So I'm gonna just start my slideshow now and do a really brief sort of madcap dash through some history that I think we've all got in common. So, get my specs on. This is the bit that will probably go wrong now, Mike. So if I let me just open my slideshow here. Okay, so if I share my screen, give me a sec. Who can share? Okay. Right. Okay. So, here we have something I'm sure many of you are very, very familiar with. It's a stroboscopic disc. As many of you may know, this was invented in 1832, simultaneously by two people, Joseph Plateau over in Brussels, and poor old Simon, whose name I've forgotten, Simon von Sampfer over in Berlin. Now, I'm sure you all know this, so I'm just going to rocket through this section, but this stroboscopic disc, of course, it caught the eye or the eyes of our beloved Charles Wheatstone, didn't it? And this inspired him. This stroboscopic disc inspired him to get in touch with his mate de Bosc and to combine Plateau's phenakitoscope, or by its easier to remember name, phantoscope, together with his stereoscope kind of ideas to create the interestingly named stereophantoscope, which can also be called, its simpler name, the bioscope, of course. Now, look, Dennis Pellerin does a wonderful lecture on all this. I'm not going to go into the history. This isn't my area of expertise, but I thought it'd be just a nice little introduction to mention this, because as many of you may know, this bioscope was created way back in 1852. Yes, 1852. So Wheatstone, de Bosc, they're creating, with the help of Plateau's ideas with the phantoscope, they're creating animated stereoscopic images 36 years before the first surviving movie film, which was created in 1888. So how amazing that us 3D animators kind of got there so early on in the day. Right, now, as I say, I'm not going to go too much into the history, because I'm going to be talking at a rate of knots anyway without even trying to do this, but just to mention a few contraptions that I think may be of interest. So we've got this, they're all brilliant to say on a recorded Zoom lecture, the stereophoroscope. Okay, so that might be interesting. You might want to check that out. The mimoscope, another 3D device using sequential animated images. Ooh. The kinematoscope, brilliant names, aren't they? And the motoroscope. Okay, so just some little things you might want to kind of go and kind of look into if you're not already aware of these things. I think they're wonderful, absolutely fascinating. Right, so back to the almost present day, because I want to start my lesson now, and I want to tell you where my journey in animation began. It began here in this windowless basement in Holborn in London. As Mike mentions, this was St Martin's College of Art, and us lucky students got to spend 6 months here, really kind of getting to know the nuts and bolts, the absolute kind of key elements of animation that we knew we could, learning this sort of toolkit that we knew we would be able to take and apply to all sorts of types of animation, whether they be drawn, digital 2D, digital 3D, motion graphics, you name it. We knew we could apply these what you call classical or traditional drawn animation skills, and we could kind of go forth and sort of use these in our everyday work assignments and short films. And it just so happens that some of these principles, like I said at the beginning, apply to things wider than animation, i.e. titles in AV shows, images in AV shows, etc., etc. So it's these lessons that I learned as a little animator, sat at my drawing table here in the basement, that I want to share with you today. So even though you may see a lot of pencil drawing, believe me, these principles can be applied to pretty much anything you're moving around on screen. So, right. So yes, I'm not able to sort of sit you in front of an animation desk right now, as I would if we're at St. Martin's. So I'm going to take you on a virtual trip to my traditional animation studio, and I'm going to play you a little bit of pre-recorded video I made yesterday. So here we go. Hello and welcome to the traditional animation studio. So what we've got here is the light box with a light shining through this perspex disc. The disc has a little hole in it that allows you to rotate it. If you're kind of trying to do a drawing at a difficult angle, that's very handy. Importantly, it has this here. This is a peg bar. Let me go and get another one for you. A peg bar has little pegs on it. Pegs are incredibly important because these are going to allow us to register on paper, which has either pre-punched holes in it, or you can basically just go and punch them yourself with an animation punch. But this is really, really important because we're going to be stacking up lots and lots of drawings as we're animating, and we obviously want to keep them in the same place. And the same applies on the rostrum camera stand here, where we're going to test our animation to make sure it's all looking good. Another peg bar here. This stand has just got a camera kind of pointing downwards to look at the drawings when we do what's called line testing them, just testing them. You can add a light box here as well, just to allow you to sort of see through the paper a bit easier. But here we haven't got that set up here. We've got something called a character turnaround. This is really, really important because we've got to keep our drawings consistent. Here we might have something like an expression sheet. It's not the same character here, obviously, in this sheet, but this is just to show you what an expression sheet is. Again, this is all to do with consistency. Just when you're animating, you want to be doing some nice acting, but you don't want to go, you want to keep things in character, and that is basically showing you some various expressions and how far you can kind of push things with this specific character. Then, of course, we've got the storyboard. We'd be following a storyboard if we're animating, so lots of directions on that, also camera movement directions. And here we have what's known as a dope sheet or X sheet. This is basically kind of an edit timeline on its side. If you imagine something, it's very similar to that. It's breaking down things into frames, so you can use it to sort of dictate where certain mouth shapes are going to be if you're doing a dialogue scene. Levels here, for example, these are basically levels of paper. So if you imagine, you might have something like, perhaps if just the mouth is moving, you might want to have on one level, have your drawing of your body, and then just move the mouths on another level, so you're not having to continually draw that body. And all this here is instructions both for the animator and also for the cameraman who's going to be filming this stuff when you're finished. And just to point out here, I'm saying cameraman and pointing at what I've told you is the line tester. Obviously, if you're in a big production, you would line test on something very, very simple. And then when it comes to filming your painted cells, you would be on a much bigger setup. You'd be, on a really lovely rostrum that you can actually do camera tracks and pans on. Right, I've forgotten to mention the pencils. An animator will quite often be using these color erase pencils. These are color pencils. They come in a sort of selection of primary colors. Often animators use blue ones, just a preference really. Also there's a type of blue that doesn't photocopy, but that's a whole other subject. But generally speaking, animators use these color erase pencils. They're really nice to draw with. They're really nice. Animation gets quite messy sometimes, and it's nice, and it's sort of less messy to make a mess with a sort of waxy blue pencil than it is a graphite one, which gets really, really smudgy. But another reason that animators use pencils, blue pencils, or coloured pencils, I should say, is because of something called cleanup, which is basically something that happens using a traditional graphite pencil after the messy blue animation's done. So the cleanup artist will come along and they will draw over the blue animation, sometimes on a separate sheet, but sometimes also just directly on top of that blue. And they'll do what's called cleaning up the drawing. And this is a really, really important part of the process. And the cleanup artist would be, referring to the model sheet. So, for example, I did a drawing earlier, so I could speed through this really quick. I did a sort of typical sort of drawing here that you might find on an animator's drawing table. Lots of sort of construction lines in it, lots of sort of scratchy bits and bobs, things have been redrawn and re-sketched out. And then the cleanup artist, like I say, will come along with this graphite pencil, and they'll refer to the model sheet and they'll say, well, look, this animator's just sort of sketched out these knees, but actually if we look at the model sheet, they're a very different shape, these knee pads, and they've got these kind of little bit of stitching in different shape, position. So that's kind of what's happening at cleanup. After cleanup, in the traditional kind of old school process, what would happen next is that stuff gets traced onto cell, sheets of acetate, and then these sheets of acetate would be turned over, and on the reverse they would have been painted. And then, like I say, everything would be filmed, and that would include background artwork as well. These characters are actually from the first thing I ever worked on. I worked as a location designer, and I was drawing these things called layout. Let me just get one here. Layouts are basically really important because when you're animating your scene, you don't want your characters to be sort of stood in the wrong position. So you'd have something like this layout here, which is all just drawn in pencil, so that when my animation is put on the top, you can see through it. Give me a sec. I'm trying to do this with one hand. You can see through it at the layout underneath. Okay, I don't know if you can see that. And then that layout would, of course, be eventually coloured. This was done by a marvellous background artist called Ray Rankin. And you can see here he's drawn on card. Here he's painted on card, all very lovely. Now this particular show was, the backgrounds were painted on card, but the drawings would have been not painted on cell, basically to save some money, and they would have been scanned in and digitally coloured. And it's quite interesting. This project really was at a time when things were moving digital. And in fact, this rostrum camera I have here was given to me by the head of the studio because they just weren't using it anymore. They were going digital. What do I mean by going digital? I mean using something like this. Hang on. Oh, it's gone onto screen save. Hang on. This here, let me just flip this around. Oh, hang on. I'm going to lower this blind. Us animators always, we work in the dark a lot. Whether you're looking at a light box or whether you're looking at a screen, kind of having a sort of subdued lighting, it's very, very helpful. Not great for your eyes, not great for your vitamin D count. Anyway, so this is a modern day equivalent of a light box, an old-fashioned light box. It's basically a light box with a rostrum camera in it. It's basically, I mean, I've got everything here. Oh, hang on, I have to put this funny glove on before I use it. I've just put this on. Hang on. Okay, I now have my glove and my pen, and I can sort of scoot all over the screen with this without my hands scraping or scratching the screen. I got all my, basically this is just as you would see in an edit program. You've got edit timeline here. You can see some frames here. I'll just scroll through. If I push this up, there we go, there's the sound at the top. So, we can watch this character now.
Where does he get his knowledge?
Okay, and then we can frame back here. by dragging down the timeline. So you get the idea. I mean, I'm watching and previewing full colour stuff straight away. I'm not sort of having to do any testing with the camera or anything like that. I could also put my full colour background on, obviously, and watch the whole thing together. So, you know, pros and cons. There's some great things that digital animation has enabled us animators to do. But I must say, going back to do some traditional work over the summer when I was teaching at St Martin's really made me sort of really appreciate how wonderful drawn animation is and how much fun it is. And so I've left my light box up, and I think I'm going to be doing more of this and less of this in the future. Right, back to the other studio. I am sorry, I realised I turned my volume down earlier. I hope you could all hear that. When I exit out of this part one, I'll turn my volume up just so that it doesn't annoy you having to sort of try to listen to my, I hope it was okay. Anyway, so yeah, so here just to show you, just out of interest, if anyone's interested, this is the final composited image of that sequence I was showing you. So it's all sort of lit and composited there. Right. Let me just quickly shove my volume up to maximum capacity. Give me a sec. Okay. So just to really quickly, I'm going to get to relatable stuff for you 3D guys in a sec, but just to really quickly show you just how things are kind of you know, being done digitally. Here's a digital equivalent of that turnaround that you saw earlier. And if I just, this is some software I use, Adobe Animate. And if I just click this layer on here, we can see the character. So, I mean, these days, I mean, depending on the project, of course, but quite often you'll get what's called a rig, which is a character rig. And you'll sort of go and click around and you'll sort of go inside this rig. If I go inside, I'm just sort of clicking down the levels here into this character's head. I'm showing this specifically for you, Mary and Harry, because I know you like Doctor Who. If we go into, whoops, I have to take all my, if I unlock my layers. So just to show you really quickly, you know, the characters would come with a kit, you know, it would come with kind of different mouth shapes, things like that. But unfortunately, you can't get away with just using these kind of kit parts. You end up having to basically draw your own stuff, especially when it comes, you know, to things like body angles and hands and things. But yeah, I just thought I'd really quickly show you that. This is the kind of thing that you'd expect to find in your inbox if you're going to work on a sort of show these days. Obviously, the kit is kind of keeping some sort of consistency, and it's a very basic, very rigid model, isn't it? Obviously, you know, you're going to be drawing him sat down from certain angles, but you've got this as a guide. Right, so let's go into the next little section of my talk. So I just wanted to quickly make an analogy here with photography, because for me, sort of learning learning things the old school way with pencils and paper, I kind of think it's a little bit sort of similar to how you might kind of go about learning photography. Of course, you can start off with a DSLR and you can be a fantastic photographer, but I just think it's kind of personally, my personal preference is I think it's nice to kind of get to know your analog roots and sort of where some of that terminology is coming from. Just a little comment I thought I'd throw in there. So right, back to school. This is my tutor, was my tutor, Steve Roberts. He's still teaching at St Martin's. The course is now an MA, so it's but when I did it was just these 6 months. And we spent a great deal of our 6 months at the beginning of the course learning how to draw bouncing balls. So what Steve had us doing was basically observing and then animating different types of balls. So we were chucking things like bowling balls, ping pong balls, footballs, beach balls, and we were looking at how these things land. And then we were thinking, well, how do we draw that? And this exercise, this bouncing ball exercise, is actually a bit of a sort of in-joke, I suppose, in the industry, because most animators that I know did start off learning how to animate using bouncing balls. Why is this exercise given to these poor animation students? Well, it's because it teaches some really core principles, and I'm going to impart some of those with you today. And believe me, they will apply to AV shows, any sort of MoGraph, motion graphics. It all applies. You won't have to wear it. This is any excuse to stress up. That's Steve. So what's one of the things that this exercise taught us? Well, one of them is timing. Now, this is an absolute key principle when it comes to animation, as you can probably imagine. The bouncing ball exercise is teaching us to look at the sort of timing of the ball. So, you might sort of, in terms of timing, this would be where the ball is hitting, wouldn't it? How is that happening? How is that happening with a ping pong ball differently to a beach ball, which is so light, it's almost sort of falling, it's almost sort of floating to the ground as the sort of up current kind of cushions it. And this bouncing ball also taught us another key principle, which is spacing. So that's looking at sort of all the drawings in between these sort of timing points. Now, this is really, I'm aware that sort of talking in these sort of abstract terms over Zoom, it's not the kind of best way to sort of teach this stuff. But I hope it kind of makes sense to you that this illustration here, you're seeing a sort of deceleration of the ball as it hits the apex, and that as a ball would, of course, and that illusion is being created by drawings of the ball closer together. Now, like I say, it's pretty, just staring at this thing, it might not be immediately obvious why that would happen. But if you do something as simple as just get yourself something like a coin and a camera phone, you can observe the difference in moving a coin from A, if you look at the top illustration, from A to B, and keeping that space, that each time you move and take a picture, move and take a picture, you keep that spacing equidistant. You can observe the difference to if you do something on the lower illustration, which is called easing in and easing out, we call it. You also call it cushioning as well, but in software you'll probably see it referred to as sort of easing, I expect, and you'll have all your interpolation graphs and all sorts of more complicated things. But basically what this exercise does is it really lets you see an immediate sort of playback and result of changing that spacing. So I've prepared some examples just to kind of try and illustrate that for you now. So if the first example is going to be equidistant spacing as illustrated on the top here. So let's have a look at how this coin moves. Pretty consistent movement, isn't it? It may be, suitable for, like, say, if you were animating something really kind of inorganic, like maybe a sort of coin moving down a conveyor belt or something like that. But then we add a little bit of easing out and easing in. Whoop. Oh, have I pressed? Hang on. Oh, sorry. So here we go. So now can you see it's accelerating out and it's cushioning in or easing in. Now, of course, you can apply this sort of principles easing to things like motion graphics. If you've got your titles coming on, sometimes it's really nice to kind of cushion into something rather than having your titles just kind of come on screen and stop. Maybe you've got an image coming in from the top. Cushioning can just add that really, I mean, it's hard to put into words, but it just to me, cushioning and easing out, easing in can come in really, really handy. So back to balls. yeah, what we were asked to do by our tutor Steve was to imagine how different balls might bounce. Imagine how that ping pong ball would be drawn differently to a bowling ball. And just at this point, I want to mention, of course, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? I don't need to tell this to you. These balls are moving in arcs. Kind of sounds obvious, right? But sometimes it's easy to forget that to kind of keep your arcs consistent, and that, you know, if you a lot of organic things, moving things in life move in arcs. You know, if I'm moving my arm, let me move in shot. If I'm moving my arm kind of like this, obviously we've got an arc happening here. If I'm walking, if I'm creating a walk cycle, when it becomes less obvious and easier to forget, you know, my elbow's moving in an arc, my knee would be moving in an arc. If I'm turning my head isn't, unless I'm a robot, my head is actually moving in an arc. It's either moving in a sort of, it's hard to do this, like that, or it's coming over the top. And so just to kind of mention arcs, because once you start sort of being aware of that, if you're kind of implementing this in your motion graphics, say some titles or something, again, it can really just add something. And it's really, for me, it's very important in things like walk cycles. You really, you know, everything's moving through arcs, the hips, everything's, whole lecture could be done on arcs. So here's a sort of challenge for you, another time if you want to have a go. Get yourself I didn't say camera phone to you, do I? Because I'm I'm sure you've got far better camera equipment than me. Get yourself some camera equipment. There we go, and have a go at sort of moving a coin. I've got a euro here because I just got back from Current 3D. Just plug my little short film there for a second. So yeah, have a go at moving something like a coin. Or even doing some drawing if you feel like doing that, and just have a go at sort of experimenting with this timing and spacing. It sounds really boring, doesn't it? But it's actually a really fun thing to do. It's amazing the weight and mass you can give this coin, the different sort of properties you can give it just from changing the timing and the spacing. So what's next? Hang on a sec. So yes, so here's something that my students did this summer. Here's one of my students bouncing balls. This is exactly what we were doing. This is filmed on a light box with Peg Bar mentioned earlier. And you can probably see that this student has added something else into the mix. They've added something that we call squash and stretch. And this is absolutely lovely, I think, what this student's done here. They've got, I don't know if you can see this via Zoom, but they've got a sort of the ball's easing out as it enters in. It's accelerating, and the acceleration is sort of making it deform. As it hits the floor, it whacks down, splats out, and then kind of bounces up again. That's still deformed, and it kind of comes out. And as it slows into the arc, it's kind of regaining its ball shape. It's a very nice thing that I think this student's done. And they've done something which is quite tricky, which is they've kept their volumes consistent. Now, this is maybe not so, you know, you think, oh, you know, not so difficult with a ball. But believe me, if you're doing a whole scene you're acting out a whole scene, it's very easy to get to the end of the day and suddenly realize that your hands on your character have shrunk. Or a classic one is a sort of distance between an elbow and a wrist, or a knee and a foot. So well done to the student here for doing some squash and stretch, but keeping those volumes consistent. Now, how am I doing for time? I know I'm going really fast through this. Oh, it's not too bad. Okay. The student's doing something else which maybe isn't immediately apparent from this preview, but it's something very, very important in animation, and it's something that can really be used to good effect in all sorts of moving imagery on screen, and that is the use of keys. And I have prepared a little, not as long as the last one, don't worry, a little sort of 7-minute lecture on these things that we call keys. And I'm not going to tell you what the lecture is about. I'm just going to press play, and yeah, please enjoy this lecture. And please don't look at, I was telling Andrew and Mike earlier, the only chance I had to film these yesterday was after I went swimming. So please don't look at my chlorinated eyes and goggle marks. Look at the drawing board.
Right, hello, welcome back to the traditional animation studio. Now I'm going to tell you all about keys. So keys, or key drawings, are a very important thing in animation. They traditionally be done by the animator, and they would basically be the key poses, expressions, timing points of a sequence that would be drawn first and tested. So for example, if you call it keying out a sequence of someone sat at a light box, a key pose might be here at the beginning, then I might look at someone coming through the door, so you want to hit that point, and then I might raise a hand or something, and so on and so forth. So those would be like the key frames, the key drawings of a sequence. Excuse me, and those would be tested. And when the animator was happy with those, traditionally what would happen next is these keys would be handed to an in-betweener. Now, an in-betweener is not a young boy in a Channel 4 comedy series. An in-betweener was traditionally someone that would now in between those keys. Anyway, so now I'm going to demonstrate to you. Oh, I need some paper. Hang on, cut. So I've got my paper. I put it on my paper bar. And what I'm going to show you here is how to in between the first little sort of drop of the bouncing ball in the sequence I showed you earlier. So obviously each ball would normally be drawn on a different piece of paper, but I'm just going to save some trees here and draw it all on the same sheet. Just imagine every time I draw a ball, it's on a different sheet. So I, the animator, have keyed out this ball. I know that I want a ball here and I want a ball on frame 13. And I'm now going to hand over my keys to my in-betweener. And I'm going to use this thing called a timing chart to show the in-betweener where to draw the in-betweens. Now I want, on frame 7, there to be a ball smack bang in the middle of 1 and 13. So my in-betweener looks at this chart and thinks, right, okay, put a piece of paper down. Let's draw a ball here. And I want there to be 1 smack bang in the middle of 1 and 7. So my in-betweener would put a piece of paper down, again, in between, 5. And I want there to be a drawing smack bang in the middle of 1 and 5, so my in-betweener would look at this. Okay. And you see what I've done here? I've eased out, haven't I? Remember from earlier, I've eased out. And I want my in-betweener to draw in there. It's okay, between 7 and 13. Here comes 9. Whoops, keep your volumes the same. Very, very important there. Don't want the ball kind of expanding, contracting. And I want one kind of, as it hits the ground there at 11. Okay, so like I say, these would all be on different pieces of paper. I'd take them and I'd line test them over there on our rostrum stand. I don't know what's on there at the moment, that should be there. But obviously, as I'm doing this animation, I'm not always going to be drawing balls. I might be drawing some quite complex character animation. I don't want to keep going over to the line tester every time I want to check if something's working. So what do? Well, what I do is Oh, and by the way, when I'm doing these drawings, if I was using different sheets of paper, of course I'd be using my light box a lot to be able to see through the different sheets of paper as I draw my in-betweens. Another thing that us animators do is called rolling. Now this is nothing to do with a sort of quick cigarette break. It's actually to do with being able to preview your animation without having to go all the way over to the line test. Now I'm just rolling these last 3 frames here. Now this is great when everything's in sequence, because I'm going from 9 to 11 to 13. But of course, if I'm doing an in-between, things get a bit more tricky, don't they? Because now my roll is out of sequence, isn't it? So what I do is I do a thing called flipping. Now this is a bit of bit of an art, and I have to say I'm not an expert at it. It's not something it's something that you have to sort of practice quite a bit. But generally speaking, what you do is you take the in-between, your page that you're in-betweening on, between your thumb and forefinger, then between your ring finger and whatever that finger's called, you take the second piece and you look at the first drawing, the last drawing, and then you sort of spread your hand to look at, you look at the first drawing, the in-between, and then the last drawing. So you're going bump, 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 bump. And some people actually put a sort of rubber band on there because you can sort of start to lose the paper. But once you get into the thing, you can kind of just about see that movement. As you can see, it's not something I'm well practiced at. But of course, nowadays, a lot of the time, especially in the commercial world, things would be drawn straight into the computer. This is going to let you flip all your drawings very quickly by just previewing them, just as you would on an edit timeline. And it's going to let you do the equivalent of use your lightbox to see through your sheets of drawing. There is something magical, I think, about doing stuff on paper. There is something lovely about seeing drawings come to life. And it certainly feels nice to be just sort of sat here drawing. It's a different experience to drawing on this thing, but obviously the digital way of doing things has some real kind of pros, especially in terms of immediate playback, which is fantastic. If you're trying to do some acting, you can immediately see in full colour what you're dealing with. So yeah, that is my quick guide to keys and in-betweening the super old school way.
Right. Now, there's one thing I forgot to mention in that lecture when I did it. I'm going to do this really quick because I'm aware that I'm massively behind time now. I didn't mention why all these frame numbers are odd, not even. You can probably guess. It's because basically I'm doing this sequence on what us animators call twos. So that basically means that for every, I'm holding each drawing for 2 frames. So if you look at this little very madly drawn chart down the bottom, I'm holding drawing 1 for 2 frames, I'm holding drawing 3 for 2 frames, and so on and so forth. There's no rules when it comes to using this whether things are held for 2 frames, or whether you do something on what you call singles when you're moving every frame. Obviously, if you're animating something like, I don't know, water or something, or smoke, you're going to be wanting something really super fluid. So you'd be wanting to use singles. If you were animating maybe like a robot, you might have it, kind of more sort of jerky movement. And there's no kind of rules where you start a scene using 2s and you have to stick to 2s because that's the frame rate. That's not how it works. It's all about this spacing. And I know this is probably not feeling directly relevant to sort of animating some titles flying on the screen in an AV show, but honestly, once you sort of get a feel for this timing and spacing, doing these drawings, I can recommend it. It really kind of gives you anyway. Right. So, final part of the lecture. I say we're running behind time, but we've actually covered a huge amount of groundwork. We've actually covered 6 of the 12 what we call animation principles. And these 6, first of all, what have we covered? Well, we've covered timing. We've covered easing in and easing out. Remember, slow in, slow out, fast in, fast out. We've covered squash and stretch that we saw there with the ball deforming as it hits the ground. We've covered arcs, the importance of arcs. We've covered the difference between animating what you call straight ahead, which is when you're moving something, and keying, which is where you key out and then in between. And we've also covered, I didn't really kind of go into much detail, but we've kind of covered a principle called solid drawing. So we're kind of keeping, remember with the ball, we were kind of trying to, even though we squished it into sort of a pancake shape, when it reforms into a ball, we're kind of trying to kind of keep those volumes consistent. Now, these 12 principles of animation have been around for a very long time. They've been used by Disney animators since the 1930s, but people kind of know them from a book published in 1981 by two Disney animators, Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnson, and this book is called The Illusion of Life. It's a great book if you want to kind of go into a bit more depth into these 12 principles. So for the remainder of the lecture, I'm going to cover the other 6. These are especially relevant to motion graphics, AV shows, camera moves, all sorts of things like that. So the first one we're going to look at is anticipation. Now, this isn't really to do with making the audience wait for something to happen. It's more about giving them a sort of heads up that something is going to occur so they don't miss it on screen. So, for example, if a character is going to bend down and pick up a ball, it's often quite handy for them to do a small action in the opposite direction of the main action. So that would be moving up, wouldn't it, before they go down to get the ball. Now, a quick disclaimer here, these principles, you know, they don't apply to all animation, and, you know, something like this, you can imagine it's quite a sort of, if you really have a lot of anticipation, it's going to make stuff quite cartoony, isn't it? So it's maybe not going to apply so much to something like a manga cartoon. You know, you're not going to have people kind of, you know, if someone in a manga cartoon reaches for a cup of coffee, they're not going to do a sort of comedy kind of whoop before they go for the cup, are they? But, you know, used subtly, it can really give something. And actually, when I showed my students this summer, I showed them a sequence from my neighbour Totoro, a very gentle sequence where the characters are stood at a bus stop, and if you frame through, there was these little single frames, tiny little bits of anticipation. And it just, again, moving it back to something like titles in an AV show, if you're going to move those titles suddenly, really just adds this little accent, this little something, and makes it less microscopically confusing for the audience to sort of see those titles whiz off. I shouldn't say confusing, it's just minor distraction sometimes. If the eye doesn't quite catch something moving, you'd be surprised how anticipation can kind of add. And here's another example, classic sort of case you might see if someone's kind of coming down before they jump up. Again, with titles, you know, if you do something like this, you call it in animation winding up. You're sort of winding up before you're springing off into an action. You can imagine the extra force, that extra kind of oomph that gives the character. And here's a little, just something I worked on just to show you anticipation in action. A really super simple Cartoon Network show I worked on, and you can see the anticipation here. The character, let me just skip back. Whoops. Okay, so we've got a little bit of anticipation on the stairs. Before the stairs kind of crush this poor little guy, they go out then in, and before they split apart, they're going to go in then out. And before he falls flat on his face, he's going to come back a little bit and then fall flat on his face. I won't go through that again now because it's, you know, we're short of time, but. And from the same show, this Cartoon Network show, we got a silly bit of anticipation here. You're going to see a big bit as a Viking character pulls back a heavy, whatever you call that, club thing. But you also see it before he falls in the water. He actually defies physics and he moves up a bit before he falls down. And it just is almost sort of telling the audience, it's almost sort of a kind of heads up to the eyes, if that makes sense, and also sort of gives a little extra, like I say, oomph. I think that's the only way to describe it to the action. So now next principle is follow through and overlapping action. Now, this is a show I didn't animate, but I directed. And we've got some lovely follow through and overlapping action here. Let's just watch it through once and I'll play it again. So basically what's happening with follow through is basically meaning that the action is kind of kind of continue, almost sort of continuing on past the main, what you would call keyframe. So we've got, for example, in the character's hands, we've got in the character's hands, they're sort of gesturing, and you notice they're sort of going past the main pose and then cushioning back into it. So sorry, this is so difficult to do on Zoom. Let me just move my, try and move this out of the way so I can grab my thing easier. There we go. So yeah, if you look at this character here, this orange character, he's going to put his hand down into the main key pose, which is that. But you look, he kind of goes over it and then back. He comes over and then back. And that kind of overshooting is absolutely fantastic when it comes to things like camera moves or moving some sort of graphics. You know, if you move your titles on slightly further than your key, your where you want them to settle, and then you kind of move them back, it just gives a really nice sort of accent to things. It's a little bit like, I suppose, a car stopping at some lights. You know, it would kind of come over and then sort of settle back, wouldn't it? And this is this kind of thing. And the overlapping action, well, I mean, this is basically, you know, this character, so many different things are happening at so many different times. You know, his hands coming down, but his head hasn't settled yet. His limbs, they're all kind of moving at different times. And this is really kind of giving some life. So again, to sort of apply it, I don't know, to some titles, maybe, I don't know, just maybe if you're thinking about some titles, maybe you might want like the dot of the I to kind of be moving at a different rate to the stem of the I, talking about letter I here, not a I. So yeah, and then related to this, which isn't in the 12 principles, but it kind of is drag. And this is from a show Mike mentioned earlier, this CBeebies show. It was all about these silly little insects. And there's this great example of drag. Drag is basically, it's kind of like the aerial on the car that kind of lags behind. It's the antennae and the feet on this strange little gymnastic flea. Don't ask me what this series was about. So yeah, it you know, you can see the drag there. The tendrils, the kind of little arms and legs are lagging behind. And again, just a nice thing to bear in mind when you're creating motion graphics is to have this sort of sense of drag. Right. Secondary action. The as I've got it, the 8th principle, but these are in no specific order. This one is often misunderstood. Oh, can you switch that kettle off a sec? Sorry, got some background noise. I'm just directing here. Not on my set, Keris. Quiet, please. Filming in progress. Thank you. Okay, so this, what I've got as number 9, but it doesn't necessarily have to be number 9, is secondary action. Here's something I prepared earlier. People often think secondary action is something, they confuse it with overlapping action. So they think that, you know, the cap's moving at a separate rate, the tie's bouncing at a separate rate, you know, the head's moving at a slightly sort of offset from the body. But it's not. This is the overlapping action I mentioned earlier. What secondary action is really more to do with acting. So if we look at Mr. Trump here down bottom left, the main action is that he's eating a poisonous mushroom. Hooray. The secondary action is that he is closing his eyes. He's kind of like enjoying this treat so much, you know, he's almost in sort of mushroom ecstasy. And so that's what secondary action is. It's a sort of action that you know isn't necessarily necessary, but it just adds that little bit of sort of acting that sort of hopefully gets the point across. So another good example of secondary action would be if I was really sort of angrily bashing on the door, knocking on the door of the London meeting, saying, you know, let me in, let me in, you so-and-sos. I've renewed my membership. That would be the main action, the angry knocking on the door. The secondary action would be the fact that I've got my other fist sort of clenched, you know. So, you know, really, really sort of adds adds the fact that I'm angry. Or maybe, you know, you're opening a box of stereoscopic, of some Victorian stereo cards you've just got on eBay. The main action is the opening of the box. The secondary action would be something like a sort of, maybe a sort of anticipatory sort of, you know, you really, really can't wait to get these stereo cards. Right, so number 10. Number 10, nearly getting there. This is staging. Back to this background I showed you a little bit earlier in my studio. This is from a show called Bounty Hamster. I haven't got time to explain the premise. It was kind of a bounty hunter. Girl hires bounty hunter, accidentally gets bounty hamster. So yes, this show involved a girl who was girl size and a hamster who was not quite hamster size, but a lot smaller than the girl. So I thought it'd be a good example of staging, to show you staging in this show, because if I just pause, whoops, oh gosh, sorry, hang on, it's gone back. Where's my thingy? Right, so yeah, so if I just fast forward. So yeah, you've got an immediate problem here with these two characters, because one's a lot bigger than the other. So that creates some staging problems. And here, the background is almost sort of pointing at the hamster, isn't it? There's also some lighting on the floor, which is drawing our eye. Obviously, the composition of the frame is drawing our eye towards the hamster, so he's not getting lost. And we will see later on, we're going to sort of normal one shots now, singles you call it, I'm sure you know. This is a good thing. So basically this shot works because of the staging. The hamster's in the middle of the frame. So this joke that he gets picked up by someone rushing on works because your eye's not dragged all over the place. I'm sure I don't need to give you all a film studies lecture, but you know, making sure the audience is looking in the right place is obviously key to things. An example I gave my students this year was the film, the live action latest Mad Max film. There's a great, you can find an interview somewhere online with the director. It's very, very interesting. I don't know if you've seen Mad Max, but it's like, it's just crazy fast cutting. It's just ridiculously, it's just cut. And the reason that's not completely annoying and frustrating to watch is because everything is framed on the camera crosshairs. So the director was basically shouting throughout the shoot, keep it on the crosshairs, keep it on the crosshairs. So that allows you, you know, if you're the audience, you're just sat there looking straight in the middle of the frame, and you can cut very fast and things will still, you know, kind of work. Perhaps not relevant for stereoscopy, which is more concerned with giving the viewer time to kind of look around the image. But anyway, I just thought I'd mention this. And if I scoot forward at the final shot here, we've even got the girl's hair is pointing at the hamster. So, you know, we're really... Animation, it's far easier to do this sort of thing in animation. Obviously, if you're on a live action shoot, it's not very easy to kind of tell the actors to sort of position their hair in the right angle. But yeah, anyway, so this is staging. And exaggeration, yes. Animation, again, you know, these rules don't apply to everything. If you're creating a really beautiful, poetic, subtle film, maybe you don't want to go so much into exaggeration, but often exaggeration is used in animation. Here's something that I did for a BBC satire show a while back. I'm not very proud of it, actually. It was a bit of a mean comedy sketch. I feel really bad about it. And the creators of the Mr. Men really hated it. But, you know, I was young, you know, I was trying to be funny. I regret it, I'm sorry. But yeah, I just sort of I show this as an example of exaggeration. I was asked to draw a drive-by shooting scene with Mr. Happy in it. And I thought, well, I'm not just going to shoot him once. I'm going to shoot him across his entire body and then make him not look happy anymore. Literally turn his smile upside down. I'm sorry, Mr. Happy. But yeah, quite often animators say, and again, this applies to more cartoony stuff, push it as far as you can go and then pull it back. So, you know, if you've got someone hitting, if you've got someone hitting someone over the top of the head, you know, you might want to try them jumping up first and then coming down on them with their full body weight. I don't know. Anyway, I'm sounding really violent now. I'm not. Oh yes, and also on the subject of exaggeration, I just want to show you really, really quick something that I did the cleanup on. Remember I mentioned cleanup earlier? This was some titles for Jerry Seinfeld's show, and for some reason they thought they were going to use this baseball match. And I just wanted to show you, because it's a baseball game, you know, things what you were wanting to, you know, you had to, it involved a lot of quick moves, you know, whacking a ball, throwing a ball, it's all quick moves, isn't it? And we weren't using motion blur. You see, if you look at my, I don't know what your screen view is like, but if you look at my hand now, I'm moving it, I'm creating some motion blur, right? Which is allowing your eye to follow the action. I don't need to tell you what motion blur is. In animation, in traditional animation, we draw our motion blur. So if I just frame backwards and forwards, can you see we're sort of doing something called, with the delightful name of smearing. So can you see if I'm just framing backwards and forwards through this, we're actually drawing multiple arms. And so if you think back to that very beginning exercise with the bouncing balls, you know, sometimes you might want a ball to really quickly hit the ground, but you don't want that to be a weird sort of, you know, you want the eye to follow it. So what you would do is you would create maybe, you know, if there's, what I'm trying to say, sorry, it's so difficult to do this on Zoom, not in a classroom. You've got big distance between the keys, right? You've got the arm there right down the bottom of the screen, and if I go back, it's almost at the top corner. So right down the bottom of the screen, looking at the first arm, you look at the first arm, it's right down the bottom of the screen, first arm is right up the top of the screen. So it's like a massive jump. It would do what we call click. So what do? We create this great big smear of different arms. And of course, you'd see this maybe, you know, say in like a sword fight or something. If you pause the frame, you might see a whole sort of arc is drawn between the two sword positions. It just allows you to kind of keep that timing really, really quick. Because of course, if you added extra drawings, as we saw with the bouncing ball, it wouldn't work, would it? It would slow the movement down. So I hope this makes sense. It's kind of, once you do it, it's really, really intuitive, but I feel like I'm probably confusing people by talking about it. And then our final of the 12 principles is one called appeal. Now, back to the Lingo CBeebies show again. Sorry, I'm not, I am available for work. I feel like I'm going through my back catalogue here. So this is a character, it's a CBeebies, for those of you who don't know, it's a preschool show. So everything has to be really, really cute, okay? And I'm showing you this because when often people misinterpret appeal for meaning cute. So they say, you know, oh yes, you know, Lingo has appeal because Kate's done the classic thing of creating something with big eyes, you know, it's almost sort of baby-like proportions, you know, so you'd say Lingo has appeal, but actually, I'd hope you would anyway. But no, that's not what appeal means. Appeal is more, it's a very difficult one to sort of define. It's basically to do with balance. So when I was drawing this guy, I would have, you know, kind of started off with different shapes. I would have had smaller eyes. I would have had maybe the mouth lower down, you know, but I would basically move and redraw these shapes until I felt that it had this appeal, which can only really be described, like I say, as this sort of sense of balance, or you might sort of call it the X factor, I suppose. You know, if you've got two characters on screen, one's got appeal, one hasn't. It's more to do with balance and immediate being. It's also to do with, a bit like with the staging, it's to do with sort of immediately reading something, if you know what I mean. So your audience doesn't have that sort of microsecond of what, they kind of immediately sort of get it. Probably not from this drawing here, because I've screen grabbed it from a terrible old low res copy. But I hope you hope that sort of somehow explains what appeal is. So yes, that's all, folks. This is the end of my super fast lightning speed sort of smear run through some basic animation principles. I haven't kept stopping throughout the lecture to sort of apply it to sort of AV shows and general motion graphics, because I hope that it would kind of be be apparent. And I really hope that some of that is of interest, and maybe, you might even implement or consider implementing some of it. I don't know. Just to do some final things, to plug some books. Steve Roberts, who you saw in the catsuit earlier, holding a bowling ball, his new book's just come out. Let me move my oh, hang on. Can't find my cursor to move my. I hope you can all see that. I hope my you can. Cool. Okay, so this is Steve's new book. It's aimed at real animation beginners. He's basically put his MA lesson into a book. So if you feel like doing an animation MA for about £15 and you don't have to write an essay at the end, I recommend buying this book. This is a classic, an absolute classic, The Animator's Toolkit. This goes into much more depth. This is by someone called Richard Williams, who was a bit of a animation guru. Sadly, he passed away recently. But yeah, he's a guy who took animation to absolute extremes and is a very interesting character. Have to say, he did traumatize a few friends of mine. He had a studio in Soho in London before he retired. But yeah, fantastic animator, just really, really quite, taking things to the limits of what animation can do. And finally, a book that, again, has just been published in the last couple of weeks. This is by Jez Stewart. Jez Stewart is animation curator at the British Film Institute in London, and he's a really great guy. And he's been very nice. Just to plug some more of my work again, if you wouldn't mind, Mike. I'm working on an archive project at the moment. I've got an amazing computer animation archive in my garage, and I've been working with Jez Stewart, and it's looking like now the entire archive is going to be put in their great big fridge, which is absolutely marvelous. And they'll also hopefully be helping me with some digitization, which is wonderful. But yeah, if you want to learn some stuff about early British animation history, I thoroughly recommend this book. With its terrifying cover, absolutely awful, isn't it? And apparently, if you buy loads and loads of these books, they're all slightly different covers, and they will animate. So, and that's quite a cool idea. And not that you want to see this animated. It's terrifying. So that's it. That's the end of my whiz through. I hope it's been coherent. I hope it's been of interest. That's it.
Kate, it's certainly been of interest, and thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. Your enthusiasm for animation certainly comes across big time. Yes, so actually great now to have an insight into the considerations that have to be given in putting together an animated show. So I don't know, I'm sure that some of our attendees will have questions to ask. So I'm going to unmute everybody. Let's see. There we are. Yes, you should all be able to unmute yourselves now. So if anybody does have questions to ask, raise a hand. Might be quite a good idea to start your videos again so we can see you.
Hello. All right, there's my hand.
Yeah, it's Mary.
Hello, Mary.
Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering, when you were doing the drawings of the ball and you numbered the balls and so forth, I'm assuming that those numbers wouldn't be in the final picture that or the video. Do you number the sheets instead of the balls when you're doing the sheet, if you're doing the paper version, so that if something drops, you don't get them all mixed up?
Absolutely right. Yeah, sorry, I went through all that far too fast. So what I should have done really, if you were in the room with me, I would have drawn each ball on a separate piece of paper, and you would have seen the light coming through the light box, helping me trace between the keys.
Mm-hmm.
it really, the balls weren't coming out well on my video, and also I was just trying to save some paper, I'm sorry. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And then you'd have that dope sheet thing, which is really difficult to describe in like 2 minutes. But basically that would have a breakdown of the mouth shapes, what you were doing with each level. So like, say for example, in Disney films, you tend to have everything on the same level, but on a kind of cheapo cartoon series, which I work on, you have things on different levels, because, you know, you might, you think about a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, you quite often sort of see like Yogi Bears like stood there static, and then just like the mouth is moving. So you'd have on the dope sheet, hold the body for so many frames, move the mouth, maybe cycle the body through 3 different drawings just to do what we call keep it alive. So it's not like dead, but it's just looping those 3 body drawings. So basically you don't have to draw a body every time you draw a mouth shape.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
Paul Gibbs, I think.
Yeah, can I ask, what really made you got started, and what's made me thinking about this? I just remember that my maths book at school, I made a flick picture through the sort of thickness of that much of a cannon and a ball flying across and getting some little sort of peg person on the side. But what was your earliest animation that you did?
Oh God, well, thanks for asking. I think it was probably some model animation. And actually, in my garden, when I was a kid, using one of those like model sort of maquettes you position to help you do your drawing. Do you know what I mean? I can't actually think.
Yes, yeah, the wooden things, yeah.
But no, I did this film degree. It was pretty useless, actually. And then I sort of didn't know what to do. And I wanted to get into animation. I didn't know, I wanted to do model animation, I wanted to do drawing, wanted to do it all. And then luckily I realized through looking through various ways that are too long and boring to go into, I realized if I learned the principles of drawn, what you call classical animation, they could be applied to anything. So luckily I learned the kind of nuts and bolts in the drawing, and yeah. So that's what I wanted to share with you.
So at what age then did you do your first animation then? As an idea, I mean, did you do any animation on movie or anything like that with like moving objects or?
Well, I wrote to Rolf Harris. I said, Rolf, I want to do animation when I was really little, when I was about 11. Luckily, I didn't get on going to that on Zoom. Cuts. Yeah, no, and because I wanted an animation camera, but I just couldn't. I couldn't. Basically didn't have a stock frame camera. He didn't send me a camera. So yeah, I think my first animation was on a Super 8 camera, which allowed me to single frame probably about 15, 16. But I always loved it.
And what was the subject then, just briefly?
Oh God, it wasn't even a film. I've still got it. I must digitize it. It was just moving. It was this creepy mask that I'd stuck on this maquette with some cotton wool hair. And that's where I learned how annoying model animation is, because I realized that the cotton wool hair was actually, when I got my film back from the lab, it was all buzzing around the place. I realized how annoying model animation is for things like that. But you don't realize are moving, but yeah. So yes, yeah. But nowadays, of course, with camera phones, you can start ever so young, can't you? It's fantastic. I envy the kids.
Any other questions?
I'd be interested. Anybody else done any animation themselves? Any thumbs up if anybody's animated anything?
No.
I think Jeff Boller is saying yes. Big time.
Jeff has had some really nice movies I've seen at the NSA conventions.
Okay.
Oh, you might see some more this afternoon, Mary. So,
just happen to randomly show up. I don't know.
So
excellent presentation, though, Kate. That was excellent. You're speaking my language. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I think at this point we should say thanks to Kate again for her talk and the discussion.